Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming back and joining us today as we continue to explore the rise and fall time and again of King David. And we know him as colloquially as king, but it took him a long time to become king. And so I want to welcome today, and I'm joined with the Reverend Dennis Fotinos, which many of us know from his long service in the church and here at Trinity Church. Dennis, thanks for being with us today.
Good to be with you.
Yeah. Well, brothers and sisters, let me just recap where we have been. We started talking about the nation of Israel going from being led by prophets to saying they want to be led by a king like everybody else is led by a king. God saying, no, you don't want this. Believe me, you don't want it. And they say, yes, we do want it. And then they get their king. And then we spent some time looking at David's slaying of Goliath and what the dynamic of that famous story in the life of King David. Last week, David Henson and Dina Whalen spent some time looking at David and Jonathan and the relationship that they have, how that is complex in that Jonathan is Saul's son. And then this week, we are going to look a little bit more on the whole complexity of what is going on in the greater context of David's life, and a little bit more, well, just pull out the fact that where we end up in this conversation, we are in, to remind everyone, we're in the first book of Samuel, and we are looking at chapters that the whole story begins with in Samuel chapter 15, I believe, 1 Samuel 15, and goes on into 2 Samuel. But we're looking at chapters 25, 6, and 7 today, what goes on in there, ultimately ending with the fact that, irony of all ironies, David switches sides. He switches sides, and instead of fighting for Israel, he goes and fights for the Philistines, the actual people that he killed. Goliath was a Philistine, right? Right, Dennis? Well, so tell us a little bit, Dennis, about, I know that you have done study in this whole area, so share a little bit more about the whole dynamics here.
Well, it's a clever ploy on David's part. And
right.
As the jealousy mounts, and we need maybe to understand a little bit about the nature of ruling the country. It wasn't really a united country. It was a very loosely bound together confederacy, and that confederation was divided among the northern tribes and the tribe of Judah. And it is Saul's family, the Benjaminites, that ruled. He ruled out of Gibeah, but not in a palatial sense, not in the sense of most of what we think of like Egypt's established dynasties. And whenever you get a monarchy, there's always the worries about succession.
Yeah.
Who is going to succeed the king?
Right.
And when you have lots of wives, you're going to produce lots of children, all of whom are jealous of one another. And that all contributes to the story of David, as well as Saul's own problems. And Saul becomes jealous for his own sake, as well as that for his son Jonathan, who, as he sees David rising in popularity and in effectiveness and leading these little tribal groups, and they were challenged by the surrounding peoples There were constant invasions. We understand that there were really larger towns that often were fortified, big walls around them, and they kind of governed the local little territory around them, the countryside where the farming took place, or shepherding where the sheep and so on, livestock were kept. And that's where they had their power. So each chieftain essentially became king of that little jurisdiction, that little area. And they were lots of different tribal traditions, including the Philistines that had at least 10 kings, 10 major cities, but they were together because they had a common ethnic background and historical past that kept them in an alliance, just as the Hebrews had this tribal religious tradition of the emigration out of slavery and so on. So they had some bound family tradition. David was not from the northern tribes, but from the tribe of Judah, one of the smaller, weaker tribes, which was associated with part of this territory where he's living. Well, anyways, as the jealousy mounts between Saul and David, and Saul, we find, becomes more and more paranoid about his own effectiveness and keeping his own people loyal. He realizes he's surrounded by essentially enemies, and he needs to keep people effectively united to defend this area. And David becomes more and more popular because he leads successful battles. Well, finally, the jealousy mounts to the point that David has to flee. He's tried a few times. He's talked to Jonathan. Jonathan said, well, my dad's not going to hurt you. And David says, I don't believe it. Can't prove it by me. Saul wants me out of here, or he wants to kill me. So David flees, and he goes by himself. And he goes first to the town of Nob, which is up in the territory of Benjamin, and it's where the priests live. And he gets the help of the priest there. He gets bread to eat, and he's given the sword that is that of his own enemy, the Philistine that he is killing. So he gets this only sword that this priest has, and he gets the help of the priest. But there is an observer watching this whole thing, Doeg, who is one of the shepherds for Saul, who then reports to Saul that, hey, David got help from the priest. So if there's any question in David's mind about Saul's motives, Saul calls all the priests to his capital in Gibeah and orders them put to death. 85 priests, and if you read it all, then this guy has to go to the town and kill every man, woman, child, the sheep, the goats, the everything. There was nothing. One priest, the son of the high priest, escaped, Abiathar, who goes to David and tells him, my whole family, everybody, everything we had was destroyed by Saul. And David says, well, pretty good evidence that Saul was dead. He's out to get me. If he can, and unfortunately, what Saul does is loses his connection to God at all.
Yeah.
He has no longer the priestly source for consulting God. Should I do this? Should I do that?
Right.
So, which will lead us to the Witch of Endor, but that comes at a later part of your discussions. Wonderful stories about this. So David does flee. He goes on and he hides in the wilderness, and he gathers to himself people, malcontents, people that are out of favor with Saul and out of favor with some of the other people in the other tribal groups, even people from other neighboring tribes that are out of popularity in their own community. And he builds up a community of about 400 people, and he becomes essentially a warlord.
Right.
That I think is an appropriate Middle Eastern title. He is not a king at this point. He's a warlord. And of course, as you mentioned, he hides. He runs across throughout that country and the southern part of the kingdom, which is, again, loosely Confederation property with mixed of tribes of various people. And eventually, even though he tries to demonstrate his unwillingness to harm Saul, there are 2 times that he gets Saul in a place where he could have killed him, once in the cave and once when Saul's surrounded by the army and they're sleeping at night, and David goes in and stands over him, takes a spear and a water pitcher. And holds it up afterwards and said, look what I got of yours. I could have killed you. And of course, Saul's very remorseful. Oh, I should trust you. I realize you're not trying to harm me. But David realized, I need to get out of here. So
Yeah.
he then goes to Achish, which is over in the Philistine territory, king of Gath,
Yeah.
chieftain over there. And that's when, and David goes and offers his assistance and he gets support. Achish is kind of interested in, well, I wonder what he's defecting for. I wonder what's going on here. And it's probable that David spilled some of the business, you know, that Saul's very jealous and he wants my life. So I'm coming to you. And I've got these men and I'm their leader and we'll work for you. But he doesn't want to stay in the main town. He says, give me a little place where I can
Right.
go and I can have, and my 400 guys, or by then it's 600,
Right.
and their families and their livestock and what have you. So he gives them this town of Ziklag, which in 2019, apparently archaeologists were able to uncover and locate this town. So it's not a big place. It's not a fortified town. It's just part of the territory controlled by the king of Gath.
Yeah.
So he goes there. And what is interesting, according to the biblical account, of course, this is written by people who are in favor of David
Right.
rather than in favor
Right.
of Saul. So he's going to be put in the most positive light, even though his peccadillos are pointed out and written
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
But he goes there to Ziklag and he starts attacking neighboring groups, but they are not people from the tribe of Judah. He attacks some of the other people that are not particularly friendly to either Philistines or to the people of Judah. And so he had, and again, I would say that's how these guys had to support themselves was you attack, you take the booty, you
Yeah.
bring home the animals, the livestock, you know, and so on. So he attacks and he's very clever. And it's brutal because the descriptions are in order that no one is evident, nobody can come back and tell King Achish that he didn't attack tribes in Judah. He wants Achish to believe, oh, I'm attacking my own people.
Yeah, because Achish is a little suspicious of him.
Suspicious.
Can we really trust him?
He brings back booty and gives it to him, but he leaves when he does these raids into these little villages. He kills every man, woman, and child.
Yeah, it says
Saul did to the priests.
Yeah, it says 27 verse 9, whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive,
right?
But took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. Yeah.
Right. So there was no proof that he wasn't. And when asked, who were you attacking? He's, well, my own, people of Judah. And so Achish comes to trust him. He's there 1 year and 4 months, the biblical story tells us, working for Achish. And it comes to an end when the final showdown comes between the last stand of Saul on Mount Gilboa and Jonathan. They're mustering the troops there. Philistines, all 10 kings have come together in their accordance and allyship against Saul. And Saul then goes to consult the thing he tried to destroy, a medium to bring up, and you'll talk about that another time, but he goes to consult this source and discovers that he's done, it's finished, it's all over. But David is taken with Achish as one of the kings of the Philistines to go fight. And the other kings look at him and watch his group marching by, and they said, no way. David might turn on us in the course of the battle, and his real colors will come out, because isn't he the one they sing about? Saul killed his thousands and David his thousands. And so we will not allow him or his men to participate in this event. So Achish has to kind of tell David, gee, I'm sorry, I trust you, you're my best friend, you've proven yourself loyal, but the rest of the kings won't have it, you need to go back, so leave in the morning. And they go back to Ziklag to discover that the Amalekites, whom David has been attacking over and over again, have come and burned Ziklag down to the ground and taken, instead of killing them all, captured all the women and the children and all the animals and went off with them. And he gets back just in time to discover he needs to pursue them. And fortunately, he has the priest Abiathar, whom he consults. And he says, yes, go after them. God tells you to go after them. You will be victorious and you will rescue the people, which he does. He brings them back. But that is the beginning of the end, because the relationship with Achish then, one of the clever ploys that David does is from the booty that he has recaptured from these Amalekites that burned Ziklag and captured this stuff. When he's defeated them and brought all this back, he sends gifts to Hebron and to the various villages and sort of local patriarchs, if you will, clan leaders in the key villages in Judah, which endears him because Saul is going to die up on that mountain on Gilboa, and they're going to be needing a new king. And of course, all of the background we know, David had already been anointed. David was more and more and more in favor with God and with others. But David is also a very clever politician. And he has seen the handwriting on the wall, and he wants to be endeared to his people. So when he goes home to Hebron, sure enough, we need a king.
Right.
And so they declare, and David reluctantly, but well, I guess if you really want me to be king, I'll be your king. And eventually, now he's king 7 years in Hebron, but of course, a year and 4 months, he's over there with Achish. But he never did attack his own people.
His own people. Yeah.
He did play the game very well. He could play Achish saying, oh yeah, I'm attacking my people and here's treasure from their various resources. But he was really attacking the Amalekites and the Girgashites and others that were the loose tribes that were not part of the Philistine Confederation, nor part of the Hebrew Confederation. So he used those sources. At least that's what the accounts tell us. And the writers, he may have pillaged some of his own villages, but we're not told that.
We're not told that. Yeah. Let's talk for just a minute, Dennis, about, given this horrid story, I mean, really, I mean, just as you said, this is, we have evidence in other cultures of what would be rightly described as grand kingdoms, right? You mentioned the Egyptian kingdoms, right? Yeah. Those were established, everything we think about what it means to be a king and have a kingdom, those were present even before this whole story.
Right. Oh, right.
But what we have here is something very, very, very different. I mean, you called it what? Warlords?
They were really tribal chieftains who, and as we see the period for 200-300 years, the period of judges, they were charismatic leaders from among the tribes who, when things got so awful, when the invasions of these other tribal peoples became so oppressive, these leaders, God would raise up. There would be people who'd say, follow me, we're going to go in there and we're going to defend ourselves. We're going to fight this. And not always, but often they were victorious, and they met their task, and then they surrendered their power. They were used for a particular period of time. They were leaders for a short period, but it was a confederation. And not everybody always fell in behind them. Yeah. There were times that tribes didn't show up. Some of the more remote, the farthest to the north, Naphtali, and some of those, the closer to the center, the more likely they would be called upon and pressured by the other groups to put men into the field to go fight against the neighboring Ammonites and the Amalekites and the Jebusites and the various ones who were constantly vying for control. So this is a very early form for the Hebrews to come to a kind of monarchy, and monarchy suggesting, if they're going to look at the nations around them, that there's a succession that is created, that who's going to become the next leader? Is it going to be, are we going to select the next leader, or are the leaders going to come out of the family lineage? And we're now moving into from Saul. Saul doesn't get to put a son on the throne, but David does.
Yeah.
And David's descendants, under David, we get the unification of the northern tribes. Finally, after 7 years in Hebron, David very cleverly maneuvers sees the need. I can't stay king here in this place because this is identified with Judah. Benjamin and the northern tribes have their power centers. We need a new place. And so he conquers Jerusalem and says, this is going to be now the city of David. This is going to be the new capital. This is where we will center the monarchy. And then we read that as you go on into Second Kings, you start to find, oh yes, he has some relationship with King Hiram, another neighboring power, Lebanon, who sends him carpenters and stonemasons to build a palace. Otherwise, they're not living in much more than fancy tents.
Yeah.
They really were tribal people, nomadic largely. They may live in villages, simple. I mean, it was not on the scale of ancient Greece or much predating that in Egypt. 3000 BC and 2000 BC, what became the Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi and so on.
One gets the sense as you're talking, but also as we read within these Old Testament narratives, one gets the sense that this is almost the purpose of the telling, right? That unlike all those other monarchies, God has a special purpose for this one, right? It's like, I mean, this is like from rags to riches, right?
Is the eighth son in a small tribe of people. His older brother kind of thinks this is ridiculous, you pretentious little brat, and go home. But he was clever, and he was one that God chose, and in it, the most unlikely character, isn't it? Over and over again in the biblical story. I mean, the unlikely character is the one that God chooses because somehow that person can connect with the call of God in spite of all the imperfections and vanity and brutality. And this is tough. I mean, if you kill every man, woman, and child,
right.
There's
it's and then we, of course, this is our Christian overlay and our reading of these Old Testament narratives. But of course, on Thursday nights, we're on the Rector's Bible Study, we're looking at the Synoptic Gospels, and right now we're looking at the infancy narratives of Jesus, which we find in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. And one can hear this theological echo, at the very least, of, the angel Gabriel coming into Mary and saying, here's the impossible, right? That, here a child will be born to you. And then Luke says, with God, all things are possible. And then Mary sings this song, the mighty will be thrown down, there is this kind of echo of the story here that from something that seems like it should not become a kingdom and a monarchy, is going to become what saves, if you will, right? And so it's wonderful to read, even as, wonderful to read and see the theological thread through our faith and through the scripture, even though this is the Game of Thrones completely here. I mean,
it is indeed, yeah. And then David's children competing with one another, and David's inability to control them. And of course, if you have lots of concubines and wives, you produce a huge number of children, all of whom kind of have their eye on the throne.
On the seat, on the throne. Yeah, absolutely. Well, brothers and sisters, thank you for today. Thank you, Dennis, so much for this installment. And we'll be back next week as we parse out the next steps in this whole story of the rise and fall of David, which, as you have mentioned, eventually becomes the final rise, if you will, in the sense of the story. So, all right. Thank you, Dennis. It's been great to be with you. God bless, brothers and
You
sisters,
too.
and a blessed 4th of July to everyone. Have a great, great day.